All right then, so we'll start off with a question that came in advance, and someone wanted to know about being able to add an auto-increment primary key to a CSV file load. So there's a couple of parts to this. One is auto-incrementing primary keys, and the second is CSV file loading, and both of which have several techniques. So we'll start off with what they introduced, and they had a situation a bit like this. They were looking to do a SQL Loader control file. We've got some data here that we're loading, and it's all in the file. And you can see this data doesn't include the any kind of surrogate key in there. We just got some text. So they wanted to add some numeric values to that. And they're like, well, how can we do this? Well, the good thing about SQL Loader is there's a lot of power in it, a lot more power than people realize. And one of the things you can do with it is assign default values to columns. And one of those defaults you can assign is a sequence. So you can do something like this. If these primary keys aren't actually in your data set, you can just assign it as a sequence like that. One note of caution on this, one thing to be aware of: if you're loading really large files through SQL Loader, you might be doing it using direct path loads, so setting the direct option equal to true. This won't work if you're trying to do that. So you've got to ensure you've got the direct set to false. That's the default, so that's probably what you're doing anyway if you haven't otherwise fiddled with this. But if you've got, hundreds of thousands, millions of rows that you're loading via SQL Loader, you might have been looking into that. So bear that in mind. So this is all very well and good, but what this means is that you have to go through and edit all your control files to include this. And some of you are probably thinking, yeah, well, I don't really want to have to do that. Don't want to have to go through and change all my control files. You've got loads of them scattered everywhere. That's a lot of effort. I want it to happen in the database automagically. Now, of course, at this point, a lot of people point out you can do this using triggers, and you can do it using triggers. I don't really want to talk about that, partly because it's been around for a while and there's, performance overheads with doing that and so on. What I want to discuss instead is something that came in 12C. So we introduced some options, and we kind of caught up a bit with a lot of other database vendors at this point by introducing something called an identity column. So you can create a table and have this generated as identity field. So we got our ID and we put this identity clause on it. What that means is the database creates a sequence for you in the background. So you'll get if you start hunting around in your sequences and user sequences and things like that, you'll see these strange $$ sequences appear. That's because they've come from these identity columns. So that's how the database assigns it. It's just really doing some magic behind the covers to assign that sequence value for you. But there's something to watch for if you do this. So when we're doing it generated, the database is always going to assign this value, even if you try and provide your own. So if you do an insert kind of like this, we're saying we want to set the value to 1. We know this is the primary key value for this row. Put it in. But unfortunately, you're going to probably see something like this. You're going to get a lovely error with this generated always, or cannot insert into a generated always identity column. And that's because, like I say, the database has taken control of this column in effect for you, and it will. There is no way to kind of bypass this once you've defined it like that. But you can change it. There is a way around it. There is an extra option to this clause, this by default option. So this will now only supply the sequence value if you do not specify one yourself. So if you go down that route, you've got to be careful, of course. It's intended for situations like somebody deletes a row and you need to reinsert it with exactly the same primary key value it just had. It's kind of oops moment that does occur. If you start putting primary key values in, really high in the millions or billions or whatever, you've got to be aware of where your identity sequence is up to, because at some point they could hit. So you've got to watch out for things like that. So that's a way where you can assign these primary key values like that. But a lot of you at this point are kind of going, well, we've got this table, we've got our existing tables, we've upgraded our application from 11G to 12. Say, we've already got a bunch of sequences on our tables, you know, we've used triggers, or it's in our code, or whatever we've done. I don't want to have to go through, you know, we've got these redundant sequences. Well, the good news is you can also assign those to be the default value for a column now from 12.1. Well, you know, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the things you could do is remember that identity is just a sequence. So all the options that exist for sequences, such as the cache, the increment by values, also exist on the identity column clause. So you can set the start with and put in whatever the current value of your sequence is, you know, or set it to something much bigger than that. Or, as I was saying, getting ahead of myself, you can also assign the sequence to be the default value for the column. So that allows you to, and hello there, whoever you spot with your, I see, we can see you there, switching your video off, no worries. So that's all very well and good. So that kind of covers various options for having an auto-increment primary key value. If you've got any questions or comments on that, or anyone got any thoughts on how they would do it differently, then let us know in the chat. Otherwise, I will move on a bit and talk more about the kind of the CSV loading aspect of it. So we saw there we used a SQL Loader control file. So we were loading the data in, but I much prefer to try and to load files in using external tables. So this is where you've got a table and the data comes from a CSV. Now there's a number of reasons I prefer this over SQL Loader. One is that primarily it's that you are in the SQL engine. So you can do things like join the data to other existing tables, use all the lovely syntax we have in SQL, case expressions, apply functions, do whatever it is you want. So you've got a lot more power to do things with an external table than you do with SQL Loader, particularly if you want to do things like load half of the data, or load half the data into this table and the other half into that table. It's much easier to do that using external tables. And you can do this by creating a table like this. So we have the organization external, which tells us that it points to one of these CSV files, and we tell it where that file is, so data.csv. Now do note, this file must exist or be accessible from the database server. So if you're trying to load a CSV file that's on your desktop, you can't use external tables. You have to be able to transfer it to the database server and do it that way. If you have got a CSV file on your desktop, then you can use SQL Loader, or there's things like SQL Developer has got their import option. Fine if you're doing like a one-off load, you're trying to get some test data in and so on. But if this is a repeated load, you're kind of doing a daily import of stuff, then really you want to systematize it and actually have a process that transfers those files to the database, and then you can use SQL to load them in. So we've got our external table, and then of course, if we used our, we could just insert our data like that, nice and easy. If we had our identity column or sequence default column, everything would go in and we have those incrementing values, or of course, you can specify the sequence like that. So external tables, really like them. Oh, and someone's got a question coming in. Does it load line feed characters? I'll come back to line feed characters in a little bit, so bear that in mind. Spoduturi? I'm not sure. I'll come back to that shortly. So where was I? Yes. So we're loading file names in, loading files in, and this is all very well and good. But if you've got a daily load process, the external table points to a specific file. Now, you can actually point it to multiple files, but you still potentially have a problem if you are got a daily import. Let's say you've got external system sends you a file, you got to load it into your system. And of course, what happens is when you receive that file, it is stamped with the date. So you end up with a situation a bit like this. Each day, you've got standard file name followed by the date. And this is a bit of a fiddle to work with because you need to change your external table to point at a different file every single day. And that's just a bit fiddly and a faff, and it gets even more tricky if, let's say, they haven't just stamped it with the date, but they put the full date and time down to the seconds that the file was created. So, you know, not just the 1st of January 2018, but also it was at midnight and 1 minute and 10 seconds or something like that. And this just makes it more fiddly because you can't really predict in advance precisely what time the file's going to be stamped with. Now, you can go through kind of like a process where you receive the file, move it to a standard file name, such as sales.csv, and when you finish loading, archive it off with the date on it. That's a bit of a pain in a faff. Or we can go through and repoint the external table, like I've just done. Again, a bit of a pain in a faff, easy to make mistakes on. Luckily, in 12.2, we introduced a new feature which makes this a whole lot easier. And this is something I really like. It's called External Table Parameter Override. And what this allows you to do is at the individual query level, point an external table to a new location. So we can do it with something a bit like this. We've got this external modify clause that says we are specifying new parameters. So you can change the location, the directory, the location as in the actual file, the directory, the reject limit, and you can change where the log files and bad files go in like this. So now it doesn't matter what I've specified. I could have said that this external table points at sales.csv. By passing an external modify, it now points at this particular file here. So the one data on the 1st of April. Next day, we want to load in the next day's file, we get the 2nd, and so on. So this makes it a lot easier to deal with. So you can get different, if you've got changing file names, you've no longer got to go through that dilemma. Do we rename the file or do we repoint the external table? Well, you can just change your code and point it, get it so it receives the file name and points it to the appropriate location. Really cool. I really like that. But then people quite often have run into another problem. So we talked about reasons people use SQL Loader. One is they're using local files on, on their desktop, or for whatever reason they're not on the database server. Another reason, and something that people quite often come up with on questions when they're sending text questions to AskTOM is, I can't create tables. The DBA has not given me permissions to create tables or create any objects, in fact. What do I do? I would love to use external tables, but I'm simply not allowed to. And of course, I've got to go to beg to the DBAs and put it in their queue and wait a week for them to actually deploy that to the system. I don't want to have to do that. Well, luckily, in 18C, there is a new option, inline external tables. So these are external tables that only exist in your query. So what you do is you have your query like this, you use the keyword external, specify your column names, and then you can literally paste in the definition of your external table. So the minimum you need is the directory and the file location, but you can do all sorts of things like change the access parameters and fill it around and so on. So like I say, this literally, it's not a table that exists anywhere in your database. It's just for your query, and then reads the data and does whatever it is you want to do with it. So this can get around that problem where you're not allowed to create tables and so on. And the thing is, it's really easy to change. So let's say we find there's not just one column in this external table, there's actually two. We want to load that in as well. Well, we just update the definition like so. So it makes it much easier to kind of figure out what's going on. So useful if you've got some constraints you've got to work around. If it's your real production code, I would thoroughly recommend you create a real table. But it's very useful potentially if you need to prototype your table. So you've got to try and figure out how to define the clauses. So kind of coming back to the line feed characters question, if you've got a straightforward CSV and it's just comma separated values, nice and easy, you can just do something like this here. But things get tricky when it comes to things like row or records that span multiple lines, or non-standard terminators. You got something other than a comma as a separator, or you got different separators between different fields, or other sorts of weirdness going on in files, which you can get. This inline external tables makes it much easier to kind of prototype and rapidly develop. You say, okay, what's going to be in there? What am I doing? And so on, to try and figure out the correct definition of the file. Then when you've got it nailed down, you can create the real table. So that saves you having to go through the process of drop and recreate your table every single time. Potentially, I think this is potentially a very nice feature. And so if any of you do data analysis or work on data warehouses may find this very useful. So that was the kind of things that I had to discuss. If we talk a bit about, I have data, all right, Falik, I have data in my table, and when I load data in, like, it gives me invalid month error. Okay, we've got our table with a date in it, and we've got this date in day, month, year format, and we find, okay, we're getting a ORA error, but we can put the data in like this. That's to do with the NLS session parameters, as I was saying, and I've got my date format set to YYMMDD. Now you can change this by setting the NLS date format for your session. So I set that to day YYY, like so, and we will find that the second one fails and the first one now works. So you might go, fantastic, we've got a way around this. This is a really, really dangerous thing to rely on, because as you can see, I just set that in my session. Any client can change their own NLS date format. And this particularly becomes a problem when you start having some servers which are configured for US settings and some servers which are configured for non-US settings. As the US typically has the month, day format, whereas almost everywhere else in the world goes day, month. And this can, if you're unlucky or not careful, you can have some clients with your US settings and some with the, pretty much any other country settings. And if it's this half of the year, if it's this half of the month, I should say, so any day before the 12th, you could be loading data in and the dates could be in the wrong order, and you just wouldn't know until you get to the 13th, and whichever format is incorrect or for the source data, you can suddenly find things start getting errors. So while you can do this, and it is kind of handy if you're working in an individual session, you should absolutely not rely on this in your code. You should to-date your things like this and say what the format you're looking for is. Otherwise, you're just opening up yourself the chance for all sorts of weird bugs and so on. Okay, can we dynamic this format? The user able to enter any format he wants? Well, I mean, like I say, this is a client setting, so potentially you can have something where you ask the user what format they want and they get it out like this. But like I say, it's much better to do the to-date, and then you can still pass this as format as a bind variable format like this. much more reliable, much less likely that something unexpected is going to happen. So, you know, this is kind of handy if you're just doing a quick demo, real code, do a to date. Yeah. Yeah, as Pete says, SQL Developer is great for loading CSV data. Actually, I will just, I'll bring SQL Developer up because that has a lot of options for working with CSV data. Oh, back in the Fortran days, wow. So we've got a lot of people working with COBOL style data. Fantastic. So yeah, as Pete says, there's actually SQL Developer has a lot of good options for working with CSV data. So one of the cool things is this little import data option. So if we right click and we go to the table here, and it's going off the top of the screen a little bit, but oh, I've lost my buttons somehow. Ah, come on. Let me just move that over there and resize it, and then I'll drag it back up. And that is now not playing ball. So we can pick a file and load it in there, and you can actually do this so it will create a table for you on the fly. And hopefully, yeah, I've got the export file, so we can see what's in it there. We can fiddle around with the terminators, change between Windows and Mac and so on. And if I can get it to do next, I can't get it to resize for some strange reason, but let us, yeah, and we can now create the table. So we have new table and move along, hopefully. Why is it doing that? And we do Alt-N, there we go. Oh, I'll go back a second. And you can see we've got all sorts of things to map the data types and so on. So certainly if you're doing one-off exports and imports of CSV data, I would absolutely recommend looking at the import and export options here in SQL Developer. There is also, to get data out, there's the data export option, so you can get all the DDL, but you can also just get the data in a whole bunch of formats. So let's get CSV. We can load into separate files all the things we're looking for, and I need to say which database I'm using and so on. So we can get a whole loads of stuff out. So for one-off exports, I'd really look into that. If this is going to be an ongoing process, like a daily import or export, build a system, use SQL Loader, external tables, and so on. So you've got some CSV stored in your database, and you want to convert it into columns. Is that kind of what you're saying there, Steve? Yes. So let me just share my screen again briefly. So the short answer is there is no built-in way to do this there isn't like a convert to CSV to columns feature. However, there is something new in 18C, which kind of allows you to emulate this functionality. And I actually have a nice little demo of it on Live SQL. So let's just log in and get in. So in 18C, we came up with this fantastic new feature called Polymorphic Table Functions, which it's a crazy sounding name and sounds impressive, right? This is like, wow, we're using polymorphic table functions. And what it allows you to do is manipulate your data set. So manipulate the columns in your output. So you can change dynamically which columns appear or don't appear in your output. And one of the things you can do with this is use it to do a CSV to column converter. Yes, PTF does deserve a few sessions in the future, as you're right, very true. Judith, it is a complicated feature, but you can see there's a fair bit going on here. But now what I've enabled us to do, we passed in these comma separated values and say there's 2 columns worth of data in here, and they actually come out as separate columns. ask for 4 columns and they come out as 4 columns and so on. So you're able to now dynamically pass in some data and say the PTF can kind of munge it all, extract the information out, and convert that into individual columns as you've asked for, basically. The exact details of how this works is way beyond, there's too much to cover for us and then in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But if you're interested, head over to Live SQL and look for the dynamic CSV to columns converter for a demo. They say this is an 18C feature, so it's going to be a while before any of you have to play with this, I'm sure, but potentially very useful. If in the meantime, until you get to 18C, you're going to have to build your own kind of workaround, some kind of either dynamic SQL or build your own custom functions to deal with all the substring and in-string parsing, all the good fun that brings. But so watch for PTFs on 18C. In the meantime, you'll have to build something of your own. Wasn't that even possible before 18C with any data in any type? You may be right, Niels. To be honest, any data in any type are not things that I've fiddled with extensively. You may be able to do it. I'll challenge someone on watching to see if they can come up with their own version that does it pre-18C. There's been some good discussions. Thanks for all of you for joining me. I hope you enjoy this. More importantly, we hope you've learned something. This is an ongoing program, Office Hours, so please let us know if there's anything we can do better. If you've got questions that you want us to cover, you can submit them in advance. If you go to the Office Hours pages, give us your feedback, let us know what worked, what didn't work, how can we be better. We're here to help you be more successful with Oracle database and build better, faster, more reliable applications. So I just want to thank you all for joining me and say goodbye.